In his September 3rd, 1967 letter to Hugh Garvey, an editor at Templegate Publishers, Thomas Merton suggests that, quote, historians of theology will quite possibly look back on our age as the age of Rosemarys, or perhaps the age of the mothers of the church, end quote. Merton makes this assertion after his appreciative reading of Rosemary Haughton's The Transformation of Man, a book that Templegate published that year and a book that Merton found to be particularly illuminating. Hugh Garvey relayed Merton's remarks to Haughton, and after a brief exchange of letters with Merton, she came to visit the Abbey of Gethsemane in October of 1967. After this visit, Haughton's insights continued to echo in and resonate with Merton. For instance, during a December 1967 retreat for contemplative sisters at Gethsemane, Merton mentions the transformation of man, and in conversation with Haughton's work asserts that, quote, theology really happens in relations between people, end quote. In fact, Merton's engagement with Haughton, which involved not only his reading of her writing and his grappling with her ideas, but a relational encounter and exchange between the two, conveys a deeper pattern present in Merton's life. Like Haughton, Merton embodies an understanding that theological insight emerges in and through relationships between people. Though Merton does not explicitly identify an additional Rosemary in his September 3rd, 1967 letter to Hugh Garvey, he is almost certainly pointing toward Rosemary Radford Ruether, with whom he exchanged nearly 40 letters from August 12, 1966 through February 18, 1968. In Merton's encounter with Ruether, we see a similar relational pattern at work. Merton's receptive grappling with Ruether's insights quickly evolves from intellectual encounter through the vehicle of reading to interpersonal exchange. This paper attends to Thomas Merton's interactions with the work and worlds of Rosemary Haughton and Rosemary Radford Ruether, two pivotal and innovative thinkers whose writing and lives have contributed significantly to post-Vatican II Catholicism. This paper highlights the theological and theoretical implications, as well as the concrete contours of Merton's exchanges with the Rosemarys. By analyzing Merton's engagement with Haughton and Ruether, this paper illuminates his relational approach to theological insight and religious truth. 1. Theology happening between people. Rosemary Haughton and Thomas Merton. Rosemary Haughton was born in Chelsea, England in 1927 to Peter Dunham Luling and Sylvia Thompson Luling, a prolific novelist. The eldest of three daughters, Haughton was brought up in the Church of England, which her family infrequently attended. As a young woman, she found herself increasingly attracted to encountering God in and through the Catholic Church, or as she would later refer to it with casual affection, quote, the Catholic thing, end quote. In 1943, at the age of 16, Haughton was baptized Catholic. She recalls attending Mass amidst the devastation and destruction of World War II, worshiping in a dark church lit only by altar candles in accordance with the blackouts. One morning, she arrived to, quote, find the church a mass of rubble, end quote. Haughton's movement into intimacy with God in and through the Catholic tradition was significantly inspired by her wide and deep reading. Thomas Merton had a special place within this textual landscape. Haughton had been reading the works of Merton since she was a teenager. She, quote, encountered Thomas Merton, became somewhat intoxicated with him, and then, as it were, grew up with him as he struggled, explored, and changed, end quote. She viewed Merton as a, quote, sign and guarantee of the still, vivid, and incorruptible heart in a religion that had all too many obviously deathly and trivial aspects, end quote. Haughton's engagement with Merton eventually flowed beyond the boundaries of readership into a conversation marked by relationality and mutuality. As we have seen, this conversation was sparked by Merton's reading of her The Transformation of Man. In her prefatory note to the new edition of The Transformation of Man, written in 1980, Haughton declares that this work has, quote, long been my favorite among my books, end quote. In The Transformation of Man, Haughton articulates a theology that emerges from attention to the experiences of human beings in their encounters with one another. Merton finds The Transformation of Man to be an, quote, admirable book, an existential theology of love and encounter, end quote, as well as a, quote, fundamental statement and witness to the salvation event in daily life and in areas where, to an exclusively clerical theology, it was not previously visible, end quote. Here, Merton conveys his interest in turning to Haughton as a voice of authority, whose own positionality as a woman and mother in the church affords her unique access to the mystery of salvation in its vast and varied scope. In October of 1967, Rosemary Haughton visited Thomas Merton at the Abbey of Gethsemane in between stops in Chicago and Minneapolis on a lecture tour. In his October 27, 1967 journal entry, Merton writes of Haughton, quote, she is quiet, intelligent, concerned about a real contemplative life continuing, etc., end quote. He recalls taking a picture of the pregnant theologian sitting on the dam by Dom Frederick's Lake. He writes, quote, I hope my picture of that is good, end quote. Brother Patrick Hart attests to the fact that the photograph, quote, did indeed turn out well, end quote, and that Haughton used it on the dust jacket of her 1972 book, The Theology of Experience. Haughton biographer Eilish Ryan notes that during their time together, Haughton and Merton discussed Merton's photography as well as the theme of Christian community and the, quote, cultural task of Christianity, end quote, over a picnic lunch. Ryan emphasizes that this conversation, quote, had a lasting influence on Haughton, end quote, and that Haughton was, quote, touched by Merton's complete humanness, end quote. In Merton's encounter with Haughton, we glimpse theology happening between people, two appreciative readers, the monk photographing the pregnant theologian, creative cross-pollination animated by mutual curiosity. 2, theology happening between people, Rosemary Radford Ruether and Thomas Merton. Born in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1936, Rosemary Radford Ruether, quote, grew up in a series of matricentric enclaves led by intelligent, articulate, and self-confident women, end quote. In 1965, as a 29-year-old scholar raising 3 children with her husband Herman, Ruether completed her PhD in classics and patristics at the Claremont Graduate School. In the summer of 1966, Ruether and her family moved to Washington, D.C., where she joined the faculty at Howard University. In August of that year, she and Merton opened their exchange of nearly 40 letters, the collection of which was compiled and edited by Mary Tardif in 1995 under the title At Home in the World. Ruether wrote her first letter to Merton on August 12, 1966, inspired by the, quote, very kind remarks, end quote, that he offered after reading one of her early essays. In this essay, titled Vahanian, the Worldly Church and the Churchly World, Ruether articulates a radical ecclesiology in conversation with the work of French Death of God theologian Gabriel Vahanian. Ruether advances a critique of the ways in which the institutional church has co-opted and domesticated the living God, replacing the infinite creator with an idol of power. She observes a dilemma unfolding in which those who actively love the church also find themselves actively resisting the shapes that it has taken. And she argues that such a dilemma is perhaps felt most potently by the, quote, prophetic young Catholic priest, end quote. In a July 25th, 1966 journal entry composed right after reading the essay, Merton records his feelings that Ruether's piece is a, quote, remarkable and dangerous, two exclamation points, article, end quote. And he senses that, quote, its implications will work in me for a long time, end quote. In Merton's first letter to Ruether, sent on August 18, 1966, he requests that Ruether send him pieces of writing that she thinks might interest him, and he includes a copy of his own essay, Christian Humanism. In this letter, Merton lets Ruether know that, quote, I depend to a great extent on the light and love of my friends who keep me informed, notified, alerted, etc., end quote. Reflecting on her correspondence with Merton after the fact, Ruether recalls that, quote, although we were separated by more than 20 years in age, he is a seasoned thinker and I as a neophyte, Merton from the beginning addressed me as an equal, end quote. In fact, throughout their correspondence, Merton turns to Ruether as a theological authority. Among the numerous topics that Merton and Ruether discuss throughout their exchange, this paper will highlight the most personal and vulnerable. Though their correspondence was initially animated by Merton's interest in Ruether's radical ecclesiology, it crescendos in Merton breaking open his own questions about the church and his place within it to Ruether. In a letter composed on January 29, 1967, Merton writes that he, quote, needs the help of a theologian, end quote. And he identifies Ruether as a, quote, theologian I trust, end quote, and even, quote, almost the only one, end quote. Merton writes, and I quote, I know this is a pretty bad letter, guilt about saying all this, but I do wonder at times if the church is real at all. I believe it, you know, but I wonder if I am nuts to do so. Am I part of a great big hoax? I don't explain myself as well as I would like to. There is a real sense of and confidence in an underlying reality, the presence of Christ in the world, which I don't doubt for an instant. But is that presence where we are all saying it is? We are all pointing in various directions, and my dreadful feeling is that we are all pointing wrong. Could you point someplace for me, maybe, end quote. Ruether replies by assuring Merton that she is, quote, profoundly moved, end quote, by this letter. She sends Merton the manuscript of her book, The Church Against Itself, and notes that she grapples with many of Merton's questions directly within it. The church, Ruether insists, is, quote, surely not, first of all, the institution, end quote. For Ruether, the institutional structure serves as a vehicle for transmitting a set of traditions about a reality that is actively happening, but that is not exclusively or even centrally happening within the space of that institution. And that reality for Ruether is, quote, God's constant renewal of God's good creation, end quote. In The Church Against Itself, Ruether insists that the authentic church is, quote, a happening, end quote. On February 14th, 1967, Merton writes back to Ruether after reading her manuscript. He expresses his gratitude for her perspective, noting that she has assured him that, his, quote, own struggle with the institution was not madness, hubris, or something, end quote. He writes, quote, I agree with you all along about the hardening of the church as institution and idol, and its becoming against what it ought to be a sign of, end quote. Furthermore, Merton asserts that, quote, what you say about the church as happening clicks perfectly, end quote. As their dialogue continues to unfold, in a March 1967 letter to Merton, Ruether mentions that she senses he is in a time of personal crisis. Merton responds 4 days later by affirming her suspicion, noting that she has, quote, been the catalyst, end quote, and asking her to, quote, be my confessor for a while, will you please, end quote. As Merton opens up his struggles at Gethsemane and in the wider church to Ruether, she replies by detailing her own personal situation. Though she continues to identify as a Catholic theologian, she has rooted herself and her family in an Episcopal parish in Washington, D.C., called St. Stephen and the Incarnation. She emphasizes the importance of working with institutions by finding or forming a niche within these institutions, which is open to radical change and exploration. The goal here is to form an avant-garde, to remain rooted in the institution while also accompanying it and those involved in it into the future. Quote, an avant-garde is an avant for the sake of leading the rest, not leaving them behind, end quote, Ruether insists. Ultimately, Merton maintained his own avant-garde niche in the woods of Gethsemane. He notes in an April 6, 1967 letter to Ruether that if he is to seek another church context in which to root himself, he would want to find, quote, another honest monastic group, end quote. And he mentions the appeal but current impossibility of the group started by Ernesto Cardenal in Latin America. Ruether proposes in a letter sent to Merton in May of 1967 that Christians should, quote, should neither obey nor disobey, end quote, existing institutional structures, but instead, quote, move out into a new and more authentic possibility, end quote. And she suggests, quote, I think that is what you are working on in your context too, end quote. Throughout their letters, Merton and Ruether move from intellectual exchange to relational and vulnerable encounter. Their correspondence involves not only theoretical reflection on the nature of the church, but a deeply personal sharing about their own experiences within the church. Ruether sends Merton her writing and he sends her his. Ruether sends Merton a Christmas card featuring her daughter Mimi in a protest march and a pin from St. Stephen's Parish. Merton ultimately entrusts Ruether with 27 of what he terms, quote, some far out drawings of mine, end quote, works of art consisting of black ink brushstrokes. And he suggests that the proceeds go to St. Stephen's. He also suggests that if St. Stephen's would like to keep one of the drawings, he would, quote, be delighted to be present in the form of a calligraphy, end quote. 3, embodying a relational theology. Thomas Merton models a relational approach to theology, compellingly embodying the essential insight that he takes from Rosemary Haughton's work, that theology really happens between people. His engagement with both Haughton and Ruether was initiated by his own act of receptive and engaged reading. He read Ruether's essay and Haughton's book. He was deeply moved by the insights he found in these texts. He conveyed his compliments to the authors through their editors. He opened conversations with the authors and continued to engage their work. Through his exchanges with Ruether and Haughton, Merton learns from and converses with those with vantage points inaccessible to him. He turns to Rosemary Radford Ruether and Rosemary Haughton, and through his vast correspondence, he turns to a wide web of conversation partners with similarly inaccessible vantage points and sources of insight. He turns, for instance, to the insights of D.T. Suzuki and Thich Nhat Hanh. He turns to the insights of Dan Berrigan and Dorothy Day. He even turns to the insights of Beatrice Butrovic, a high school student in California with whom he discusses the Beatles and Bob Dylan and the Grateful Dead, as well as her underground magazine in which he publishes his poetry. Merton shows us through his embodied witness, through the web of letters that document his quest to love God and the neighbor authentically, that theology happens between people. Merton shows us that theology is not the fruit of a solitary quest, but the fruit of a communal movement. Thank you.